Joining me this morning is the Assistant Finance Minister Zed Seselja. Thanks very much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
Let's start with this. Is the government going to cut the deeming rate?
Well, look, I think the government is always looking at what we can do for pensioners, and we know that many pensioners do it tough, and we know that deeming rates is one part of that. It's about a quarter of, it affects about a quarter of pensioners, the deeming rates, and one of the reasons, of course, they've been steady is interest rates up until recently have been steady. There's a number of factors, of course, that go into what the deeming rate is. It's not just the cash rate. It's what kind of returns can be received for financial assets in a lot of other areas. But I'd make a couple of points. We fought very hard at this election to protect retirees from Labor's retiree tax, which is still their policy. So we've seen the pension go up significantly since we came to government, but we're very much listening to the concerns raised by pensioner groups, peak bodies and others. And so obviously, there may well be announcements coming, but we're very, very sympathetic to the cause.
And you're obviously not looking at it to increase it or keep it where it is.
Well, certainly we accept that with the cash rate coming down, although that's only one factor, it means that the return, certainly when people have money in the bank and the like, those returns are likely to come down.
The official cash rate's come down 1.25% since the last time the deeming rate was changed in 2015. Would it be fair to cut the deeming rate now by a similar margin, 1.25%?
Well, as I said, there's a number of factors that go into the deeming rate. And as I say, when you're talking about, for instance, the deeming rate, the higher one, when you get above the 51,000, you're anticipating that people have a greater diversity of investments. And one of the things that, of course, happens when interest rates go down is whilst people get less in their term deposits, we do see often share markets and other investments doing a bit better as more money flows into them. So there's always a balance between those two. We've got to do something that's fiscally responsible, but our very strong inclination is to try and provide relief to pensioners because we accept that this is a very legitimate issue.
And what do you say to Seniors Australia and other groups who say it should be set by an independent body or even pegged to the official cash rate?
Well, that's not government's policy at the moment, and obviously if that were to change in the future, that's for the Treasurer and Social Services Minister and others to make those decisions. But just to re-emphasise that point, that the cash rate is not the only factor that is considered. There's a number of other areas where investors get returns, where pensioners can get returns, and the cash rate affects part of those investments, but not all of them, and obviously they can go in different directions.
Look, the government is also under some pressure to do more on infrastructure. It does have you do have a $100 billion pipeline of infrastructure projects. $13.4 billion of that is set to be spent in the next 12 months. The Reserve Bank Governor clearly thinks you need to go further than that, though. Will you?
Well, what we've said is that we're ready. One, it's very substantial. It's $100 billion over 10 years, but it's actually, you talk about $13 billion this year, $48 billion over the forward estimate. So a lot of it is front-end loaded. And with a number of the projects that we've committed to funding, of course, there is a lag in terms of them getting off the ground. So we stand ready. If states and territories are able to expedite some of those processes, bring them online quicker, we stand ready. The money will flow. So we absolutely accept that more infrastructure spending is important, but it's $100 billion we've got on the table, $48 billion over the next 4 years.
Yeah, $13.4 billion this year. It's just that the Reserve Bank Governor, his comment this week was it is appropriate to be thinking about further investments in this area, in infrastructure.
Well, we're always open to it, but it's very substantial at the moment. We'll work with the states and territories to see whether some of that spend can be brought forward. I'd make a couple of other points in relation to what's happening in terms of the economy. So we've got the tax cuts, which you've talked about, and that will obviously provide some stimulus now, as well as the medium-term structural changes. But there's other things that are going to be stimulating the economy as well. Obviously, we've got things like our small business tax cuts are starting to flow, that they haven't completely come down to the 25%. So there'll be more money in the pockets of those who are investing in their small business. We've got things like the instant asset write-off, which we've increased. So there's a lot of things we're doing which will put more money in the pockets of Australians.
And stimulate the economy.
And that will, of course, have a stimulatory effect. And the other thing that, of course, the Reserve Bank Governor talked about is He said that the medium sort of projections are for a relatively strong economy. He talked about trend growth around about 2.7%. He talked about wages likely to rise. So there's a number of good things happening in the economy.
Sure, but he clearly
clearly the indications are is that they want to continue to see policy settings which grow the economy.
Sure.
Well, we want to see that as well, and we're working very, very hard to make sure that's a reality.
He's clearly concerned about the economy, though. Otherwise, he wouldn't be cutting rates to a new record low of 1% and saying very clearly to the government that it needs to go further in areas like infrastructure. Do you accept that? He's urging you to do more than you've already announced?
Well, look, we can all, I guess, interpret in various ways what the
How do you
Reserve Bank...
interpret it?
Well, I interpret it, and I read it very closely, that the Reserve Bank Governor he's pointed to the fact that the trend growth is positive. He's pointed to the fact that there has been strong employment growth, and we're likely to see that continue. He's pointed to the fact that wages growth has ticked up and is likely to continue to grow. So there's a number of positive factors he's talked about, but like any good Reserve Bank Governor, he's not suggesting that we don't continue to take measures that will grow the economy and strengthen the economy. The other point that needs to be made
He's doing a bit more than that, though, isn't he? I mean, when he says, for example, quote, "We will achieve better outcomes for society as a whole if the various arms of public policy are all pointing in the same direction." What does that mean?
Well, I guess only the Reserve Bank Governor can actually say...
What do you take that to mean?
Well, I would take it to mean that things like income tax cuts, which are putting more money into the pockets of Australians, are working with monetary policy, which is putting more money in the pockets of Australians, that infrastructure spending is supporting jobs.
So we need to be stimulating the economy right now, is what you're saying and what he's saying.
Well, we need to continue to grow the economy and grow jobs. We've seen 1.4 million jobs created over the last 5 or 6 years. We've got a plan to deliver another 1.25 million. That was the promise we took to the election. There's a number of ways you do that. You cut taxes. We're doing that.
The question is whether it's
spend on infrastructure
enough and why he's doing this and saying...
Well, I would make another...
Just quickly, he said, I mean, clearly cutting rates to a new low is about stimulating the economy, trying to get more activity in the economy. The government's plan to return the budget from deficit to surplus does the opposite, doesn't it? It's the government, by definition, keeping more than it's spending, taking stimulus out of the economy.
Well, no, because what we're delivering a surplus whilst cutting income taxes, whilst delivering record spending in health, in education, in defence, in disability, in infrastructure.
But a surplus means you're keeping more than you're spending.
Well, sure, but look...
Is that stimulating the economy?
Well, but look at all the measures we're taking. So we've got record investment in infrastructure. We're cutting taxes, substantial tax cuts both for individuals and for businesses. We've got record spending in key areas of service. And what we've said is we'll continue to do more. We're also...
I appreciate all that, but I'm just saying, is the surplus stimulatory or contractionary?
Well, you've got to look at all of the other factors that are going into it. As I say,
they're all the components of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is a surplus budget stimulatory or contractionary?
Well, you can't simply separate what we're doing and say...
Well, it's a simple question, though. Is having a surplus budget stimulating the economy or not?
Well, having a surplus budget helps us to have long-term confidence, to pay down debt and to be responsible. We absolutely have to do that, and we're not going to back away from that. But whilst delivering that surplus, we've got record investment in key areas of services, record investment in infrastructure, we're cutting taxes for individuals, we're cutting taxes for businesses. And other things we're doing, of course, is we've got measures to help people get into the housing market. And I would say to you, David, as well, that what we're already starting to see since the election is the signs of a turnaround in our housing market. I think there is growing confidence in some of our housing sectors. We're seeing some of the auction clearance rates just this weekend. I think there was a lot of people holding back with the fear of what could have come if the Labor Party had implemented their taxation policies.
So we will see house prices pick up?
Well, I expect we will start to see the housing market turn around. I think we're seeing a lot of signs around that. I think that...
So by the end of the year, you'd expect...
Well, look, I'm not going to make bold predictions except to say there are...
This is the bottom? This is the bottom?
Well, I think what we're seeing is a turnaround. I think we're seeing a lot of signs of that, and I think
we've hit the bottom.
With the various settings, I think we would expect to see some housing growth in the coming years. Absolutely.
Look, economic growth though is about the weakest it's been since you've come to government 6 years ago. Why is now the right time to be moving back to surplus?
Well, because it's been a long road to get there, David, and if not now, then when, I suppose, given...
It is economically, I'm saying, what's the economic reason, given growth is as weak as it's been since 2013, why now get back to surplus?
But remember, David, though, that it's not an either-or prospect. I mean, I don't accept this suggestion that you can't have economic growth and a surplus. Often they can go together, and we would anticipate that they will. And delivering the surplus delivers not just on our promise to deliver it, but it also means that we're starting to pay down debt. If you don't start paying down that debt, David, that debt will get higher, and then future generations will have to pay it. So there's always a bill there. I think that also delivers confidence that if there are more serious economic headwinds in the future internationally, that we've got the capacity to deal with it. And I think Australians will be very pleased with that. And I think that helps with consumer confidence and business confidence.
Okay, but if there are those
that a government can balance the books.
If there are those more serious international economic headwinds, are you saying there's that scope there to ditch the surplus if you have to?
I'm not suggesting we're going to ditch the surplus at all. We're going to deliver the surplus, but by delivering the surplus, by starting to pay down debt, you are much better placed.
Yep.
Let's be clear. If we had the settings that the Labor parties had in the past, if they didn't have the settings, of course, that we had left them when the Howard government left office, there would be much less scope. So this is very important for medium-term confidence. Surpluses are important. They're not a vanity exercise, as some in the Labor Party suggest. But when you can do it whilst cutting taxes, record investment in infrastructure, that's a positive all round.
Let me turn to religious freedom. Do you think we need a Religious Discrimination Act or a Religious Freedom Act?
Well, what we've what we've taken to the election is for a Religious Discrimination Act, and you know, people can have debates about all of the terminology and the like, but this was in the context of religious freedom. The Prime Minister has said that he's a big supporter of religious freedom, and he's taken a promise to the election to bring in a piece of legislation that will strengthen religious freedom. So, you know, it's going to be called a Religious Discrimination Act, I think. It's up to Christian Porter to drive that through. But fundamentally, I think there's a call to make sure that we get that balance right, just as we do in other areas of discrimination.
Well, one of your colleagues, Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, has launched a petition, and she says the freedom to manifest one's religion would only be limited by the need to protect public safety, health, or the rights and freedoms of others. Is that about right?
Well, getting the balance right on religious freedom is not going to be easy. And I would say to anyone who's arguing for it, and I've been on the record a long time saying we need to protect religious freedom is one of our core fundamental human rights. But legislation is not the be-all and end-all. Yes, I think we should have a piece of legislation. Yes, I think it should be meaningful. But you can't actually legislate all of our problems away. And that's one of the things we find in areas of public debate. So I'm a big believer that religious freedom is important, that we've got a promise to protect it through legislative reform. I think that's good. But I don't think we should pretend that you pass a piece of legislation and suddenly there'll be no more disputes around religion and speech and all of these areas.
Bottom line, do you think all employees should have blanket protection to express their religious views publicly, even if it does cause some offence?
Well, I certainly take the broad view that someone shouldn't be sacked merely for expressing their religious views. So, you know, where you exactly draw the line in a piece of legislation is a process for the Attorney-General to lead, and I'm sure he'll lead it very effectively, and there'll be a lot of debate inside our party room and engaging with broader
the difficult thing is, as you infer, is yes, freedom to express your religious views, but when it offends gays or Jews or Muslims or Christians, is that okay?
Well, this is, I guess, a broader question around speech. This is not just religion, isn't it? We've had this in a range of other areas, and where you draw the line on that, I think my starting position on these things is that you should allow more freedom. Now, that's never absolute. There's always a line you draw somewhere in all of these areas, and so we've got to find out where that line is, and we should do it through a comprehensive process.
Final one, you're also Assistant Minister for Electoral Matters. The idea of a 4-year parliamentary term, it's been kicked around for a long time. What do you think? Would it be a good idea?
Look, I don't think it's certainly not high on the government's agenda, I've got to say. There's a number of things that we see as much more important. Look, I think there's a range of... I think there's enough evidence to suggest that, you know, it wouldn't be a bad thing to have 4-year terms. I've seen it in the states and territories. I think there's a stronger argument at a federal level than there is in smaller jurisdictions, but it's certainly not high on the government's agenda at this point.
All right, Zed Seselja, thanks very much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure, David. Thank you.